0MT again, here with a quick note for the audience. The following is a significantly altered and expanded version of H.P. Lovecraft's original horror story, The Alchemist. Lovecraft wrote the original back in 1908, so as of today it's well within the public domain. This present version is my remix made in response to an open writing challenge set by the Elder Sign podcast. Here, I retain as much of the original story and phrasing as I can, then develop new content to address modern critiques of characterization and plot, using my own interpretation of Lovecraft's scopious verbiage and sedulous style. I previously published a nearly identical version of this story online in 2020, but this current version contains a few revisions and adaptations for audio format. I'll be using the pseudonym Wil Wroge for this effort, and possibly future efforts in the same vein, so let me know if you like it. A heads up regarding content: this reimagining explores and expands upon much of the peril, violence, and murder in Lovecraft's original, so it's intended for grown-ups who like to read eerie fiction. Please push pause if any young, impressionable, or anxious folks happen to wander into earshot. Aside from that, roughly speaking, this is my first full-length audio narration, so please be constructive, or at least merciful, in your criticism. Most importantly, enjoy the story. I Commenced My Descent by Wil Wroge. 1. High up, crowning the grassy summit of a swelling mound whose sides are wooded about the base with the gnarled trees of the primeval forest, stands the old chateau of my august ancestors. For centuries its lofty battlements have scowled down upon the wild and rugged surrounding countryside, serving as a home and stronghold for the proud, whose honored line is older even than its moss-grown castle walls. These ancient turrets, stained by the storms of generations and crumbling under the slow yet mighty pressure of time, formed in the ages of feudalism one of the most dreaded and formidable fortresses in all of France. From its machicolated parapets and mounted battlements, barons, counts, and even kings had been defied, yet never had its spacious halls resounded to the footstep of the invader. But since those glorious years, all is changed. A poverty but little above the level of dire want, together with a pride of name that forbids its alleviation by the base pursuits of commercial life, have prevented the scions of our lines from maintaining their estates in pristine splendor. And the falling stones of the walls, the overgrown vegetation in the parks, the dust-strewn moat, the ill-paved courtyards, and toppling towers without, as well as the sagging floors, the worm-eaten wainscots, and the faded tapestries within, all tell a gloomy tale of fallen grandeur. As the ages passed, first one, then another of the 4 great turrets were left to ruin, until at last but a single tower remained, standing against the hatred of time, sheltering the sadly reduced descendants of the once mighty lords of the grand estate. It was in one of the vast and gloomy chambers of the remaining tower that I, Antoine, last of the unhappy and accursed Comte de Serres, first saw the light of day, 34 years ago. Within these very walls, and amongst the dark and shadowy forests, the wild ravines and sprawling grottos of the hillside below, were spent the first years of my troubled life. My parents I hardly knew. My mother died at my birth, and my father never recovered. He ignored concerns of estate and peasantry in favor of acquiring texts, reviewing lineages, and translating ancient tomes. He became a haunted, forlorn man who looked on me always with eyes kind, yet beneath a troubled brow. Some of my finest memories recall the pride he took in me when he realized I, still a mere stripling, had learned enough Latin to share evenings studying at his desk, reading alongside him as the oil lamps burned in the sconces and the arms and armor mounted about us cast strange shadows upon the walls. When the subsequent manuscript he chose happened to be written in Greek, my father took the time in the afternoons to teach me the unfamiliar symbols and inflections, so we could again read together in the following weeks. Sadly, very few such days of mutual study remain to us. My father soon grew more manic, reacting to the slightest noise or shadow. One night, ordering me to remain while he himself snatched up both poniard and lamp, he charged out into the motte, chasing a sound which only he had heard. I searched for his flame through the windows, yet I never saw it again. Neither did my father find whatever it was he sought. Instead, he was killed, himself only 32 years of age, by the haphazard fall and horrid impact of a stone dislodged from one of the deserted parapets high on the castle. After attending the funeral return of my father's remains to our own soil, I became comte. Yet, at my young age of 7, the requisite further care and education of myself devolved solely upon our one remaining loyal and educated servitor, Giselle, an old and trusted woman of formidable intelligence. I was an only child, grappling with the notion of death at closest proximity, and the lack of companionship which this fact entailed upon me was augmented by the strange care exercised by my aged guardian in excluding me from the society of the peasant children whose abodes were clustered here and there on either side of the border between our Comte and the Comte Ache, which stretched along the plains that surrounded the base of the hill. At the time, Giselle said that this restriction was imposed upon me because of my noble birth, placing me above association with such plebeian company, that, with my father's passing, my place was to carry on his efforts and investigations. She explained, though my father never shared the specifics of his work with her, that it had all been dedicated to the advancement of his estate and lineage. Even then, the explanation seemed to me contrived. From my own earlier discussions with my father, I had learned that the border our land shared with the Comte Ache had, for centuries, been contested, with more and more of our former peasantry gradually coming under the oppressive liege of that house. Although most of these losses of territory occurred generations prior to my father's birth, it was clear to me he was still pained by them. Due to this, I suspected Giselle's cautions were intended more truly to keep me beyond the influence of this old foe. Yet now I know that their real object was to hold back from my ears the idle tales of the dread curse upon our line that were nightly told and magnified by the simple tenantry as they conversed in hushed accents in the glow of their cottage hearths. Thus isolated from any peer or contemporary, and thrown upon my own resources, I spent the hours of my childhood in poring over the ancient tomes that filled the shadow-haunted library of the chateau. This was, of the few memories I retained of my father, his most cogent, indispensable occupation. I learned much of language and ancient mysticism at his elbow, but he was too consumed by his research to teach me much of practicality, and less still to expound upon any noblesse oblige we might owe to our dwindled Comte. I must accept that I failed to understand the duties of my line, and I must painfully admit that much of this was due to my own father's choice of actions. It was clear he sought knowledge with a zeal bordering on abandon, but, at my young age, I could uncover no clear impression of the questions for which he sought resolution. I could not, at the time, fully perceive the weight he carried. It is likely I never will. Although she did not herself know, nor truly even desire to examine, the particular works which my father most studied, Giselle aided me in my continued facility with Greek, Aramaic, and still older languages. Nonetheless, whenever I felt I had lost pace with my father's scholarly inquiries, I turned truant, abandoning, for the nonce, my education, and instead roaming our domain with enthusiasm. Alone, through the perpetual dusk of the spectral wood that clothes the sides of the hill near its foot, I pierced, desperate to discover the mark, the custom, or best still, the intent of my ancestors. It was perhaps an effect of such surroundings, hemmed in soul and body by tome, wall, and forest, that my mind early acquired its shade of melancholic dissociation. Those inquiries and pursuits which uncover the prowess of the dark and occult in nature most strongly claimed my attention. Giselle guided me directly, if guardedly, whenever I was patient enough to ask. But the moment I was beyond her sight, I plumbed deeper into the lost and moldering wings of my chateau. The ever-growing number of locked doors I encountered on these ventures ultimately led me to interrogate Giselle on the subject. She assured me that she knew nothing about missing keys or abandoned rooms, but, after a short pause, suggested that perhaps it was all for the best, since the decrepit rooms would surely hold nothing but dust and dangerous deadfalls for any explorer after all these years. I do not know if the blush upon her cheeks appeared due to her covert abscondence of the keys, or the impropriety of her statement in view of the nature of my own father's demise. These barriers obviously frustrated me, though they served ultimately to increase rather than to restrain my urge to explore. Still, not all avenues were closed to me, and soon, in a disused carpentry, I chanced to discover a brace of small picks, files, and awls, preserved from rust by oil dutifully applied decades before. Though it was unclear to me if these had been used in the past for locksmithing, it was to that purpose I pressed them henceforth. On days when the weather was foul, after our meal was complete, if the library proved intolerably close, I would instead creep away with a dimly hooded lantern and explore another long, dark corridor of the chateau. Although my skills were negligible at first, my patience was copious, and, eventually, I penetrated more and more of the halls, each time defeating the lock, exploring the rooms within, then leaving again, locking the door once more when my raid was complete. In fairness to Giselle, the element I encountered most therein was indeed dust, and the second most common was peril, as a rotten floor might bend and creak shockingly beneath my boots, or a post beam as thick as my thigh might snap like a twig at the least pressure. Of the discoveries that remained, I was shocked not by their import, but by their banality. The abandoned barracks of a garrison, a galley with a wide, empty hearth, the lodgings of a smith, a tanner, a huntsman, and many others harder to determine. Only there, standing in their very rooms, did it become clear to me how much the passing of time had stolen from the Comtesse C. A whole village of people, surely generations of them, had lived and worked within these walls, all gladly giving fealty to their Comte, who, in his turn, gave them protection and brought them prosperity. My line had done to them too little service for too many years, and now none remained for me to lead, nor ignore. Of my own race I was fated to learn singularly little, yet what small knowledge of it I was able to glean depressed me much. Perhaps it was at first only the manifest reluctance of my preceptress to discuss with me my paternal ancestry that gave rise to the terror which I ever felt at the mention of my great house. Yet, as I grew out of childhood, I was able to piece together disconnected fragments of discourse, let slip from the unwilling tongue, which had begun to falter in approaching dotage, that bore relation to a certain circumstance which I had always deemed intractable, but which now became dimly terrible. The circumstance to which I allude is the early age at which all the Comtes of my line had met their end. Whilst I had hitherto considered this but a natural attribute of a bellicose and intrepid family of short-lived men, I afterward pondered long upon these premature deaths, and began to connect them with the wandering musings of the old woman Giselle, who occasionally hinted of a curse which, for centuries, had prevented the lives of the holders of my title from much exceeding the span of 32 years. Upon my 21st birthday, the aged Giselle removed all remaining bewilderment, confronting me in the courtyard, her eyes downcast, her hands upon her apron. From her pocket, she withdrew an unbleached canvas bag, tinkling and somewhat stained. Here are the keys to every door in the Chateau d'Essai, whose lock is known to me. I glared only momentarily, before softening enough to confess, I need no keys, and to wave them aside. There was, by then, not one lock in the chateau which could defeat me. She dutifully put away the sachet, imperfectly hiding what seemed a rare expression of conscious, gracious pride which crossed her face. Then, smoothing her dress, and next bringing forth an envelope, she drew a halting breath, then gave to me a family document which she humbly reported had, for many generations, been handed down from father to son, continued by each possessor. She assured me that it was my father's solemn wish that, in the event of his own inability to do so, she present it to me on my 21st birthday. Its contents were of the most startling nature, and its perusal confirmed the gravest of my theretofore boyish apprehensions. For so long, is this the reason? I asked. Yes, she said plainly. It was your father's will that your childhood would be unburdened by this knowledge, and that you would learn it only now, upon completion of your 21st year. At this time, my belief in the supernatural was firm and deep-seated, else I should have dismissed with scorn the incredible narrative unfolded before my eyes. Instead, this epistle relayed by Giselle sealed my preconceptions within an adamant vault. 2. The document carried me back to the days of the 13th century, when the old castle in which I now sat had been a feared and impregnable fortress, ruling the countryside a mile or more beyond our current boundaries. The missive told of a certain ancient man who had once dwelt just beyond the border of our estates, a person of no small accomplishments, a Vicomte Michel, usually designated by the surname of Mauvais, due to his sinister reputation and merciless treatment of the tenants of his fief within the Comte d'Ache. He was a self-proclaimed alchemist, who had studied far beyond the purview of even his liege, seeking such things as the philosopher's stone, or the elixir of eternal life, and was reputed wise in the terrible secrets of black magic. Michel Mauvais had one son, named Charles, a youth as proficient as himself in the hidden arts, and who had therefore been called Le Sorcier. This pair, shunned by all honest folk, were suspected of the most hideous practices. Routinely they ignored the duties of vassalage to pursue their dread creed. Michel was said to have burnt his mistress alive as a sacrifice to the devil, and the unaccountable disappearances of many small peasant children were laid at the dreaded door of these two. To this, the Comte d'Ache offered no response, satisfied apparently by the ample return of the taxes. Yet through the dark natures of the father and the son ran one redeeming vein of humanity. The evil old warlock loved his offspring with fierce intensity, while the youth had for his parent a more than filial affection. One night, the castle on the hill was thrown into the wildest confusion by the vanishment of young Estelle, daughter to Henri, the Comte d'Ache. For many years within the forsaken Comte d'Ache, children had gone, and their loss had been ignored. But now the missing one was a child of the Comte d'Ache, and indeed even a daughter of House A searching party, headed by the frantic father, scoured the countryside, eventually even invading the manse of the sorcerers, and there came upon the old Vicomte Michel Mauvais, his guards easily cowed, himself busy over a huge and violently boiling cauldron, placed obscenely within his very atrium, amid the tatters both of cloth and bone. In the ungoverned madness and fury and despair, the Comte de Say laid hands on the aged wizard, and ere he released his murderous hold, his victim was no more. And as this act exposed the outrages committed by the family Mauvais before both guards and servants, not one voice rose in dissent. Meanwhile, far away, joyful servants were proclaiming aloud the finding of young Estella in a distant and unused chamber of the great Chateau de Say, telling too late that Vicomte Michel had been killed in vain. Perhaps children had lost their lives in this horrid atrium, but Estelle was thankfully not among them. As the Comte and his associates turned away from the dark manse of the alchemists, the form of Charles le Sorcier appeared through the trees. The excited chatter of the few menials still standing about told him what had occurred, yet he seemed at first unmoved at his father's fate. Then, after what seemed an abiding reflection, he slowly advanced to meet the Comte de Say, pronouncing in dull yet terrible accents the curse that forever afterward haunted the house of Say. Ut tui prognati cruinti nobiles supervivant numquam, in amplioribus annis quam habetis iam. Spake he when, suddenly, leaping backwards into the black wood, he drew from his tunic a phial of colorless liquid, which he threw in the face of his father's slayer as he disappeared behind the inky curtain of the night. Though the Comte was stunned to senselessness for nearly an hour, he seemed otherwise unharmed. The Latin of the Vicomte's curse has since been translated into the grim couplet, "May ne'er a noble of thy murderous line survive to reach a greater age than thine." No trace of the would-be assassin could be found, though, at the Comte's behest, bands of peasants scoured the neighboring woods and the meadowland around the hill. The Comte and his company then made light of the work, retiring to the chateau in confidence, even revelry. Indeed, the seed of our line was replanted almost surely on that very night, for until then the Comte had borne only daughters, but soon thereafter he would have a son, the scion Godfrey. Sadly, Godfrey would be a son who never knew his father. Unwell the morning after his feast, the Comte became progressively more ill. For weeks he complained of a deep cold and numbness, which later altered and escalated into maddening sensations of burning pain. Within no more than 2 months, the Comte had retreated to his bed, tended only by a few trusted servants, tight of lip and downcast of eye. The Comte died a few weeks later, little more than 32 years from the hour of his birth. Although the house and servants refused to discuss his illness, everyone in the castle, from the most ignorant arbalister to the most sage astromancer, attributed these months of escalating misery and ultimate horrible death to the malignant phial cast upon him by Charles le Sorcier. The manse de Mauvais was shunned, and its fief reverted to the Comte d'Ache, and fell legends grew like dark thickets crowding about the abandoned abode of the vanquished alchemists. Still, true witnesses were few, and, with age, time, and the want of a reminder, the memory of Charles' curse in the minds of the late Comte's family and entourage faded, so that when Godfrey, innocent issue of the whole tragedy, was killed by an arrow whilst hunting at the age of 32, there were no thoughts save those of grief at his demise. But when, years afterwards, the next young Comte, Robert by name, was found dead in a nearby field from no apparent cause, the peasants told in whispers that their seigneur had but a few months past his 32nd birthday when surprised by his early death. Louis, son of Robert, was found drowned in the moat at the same fateful age, and thus down through the centuries ran the ominous chronicle, Henri's, Robert's, Antoine's, and Armand's, snatched from hale and happy lives upon approaching the age of their unfortunate ancestor at his woeful death. All of these generations of evidence made clear my own fate. That I had left at most but 11 years of further existence was shown certain to me by the generations of testimony the ancient document had accrued. My life, previously held at dubious value, now became dearer to me each day as I delved deeper and deeper into the mysteries of the hidden world of black magic. Isolated as I was, modern science had produced but a small impression upon me, and so I labored as in the Middle Ages, as rapt as had been bygone Michel and Charles themselves in the acquisition of ancient demonological and alchemical learning. Indeed, I felt my own father must have trodden this same ground. Yet, read as I might, in no manner could I account for the strange curse upon my line. In mundane moments, I would even go so far as to seek a natural explanation, attributing the early deaths of my ancestor to the sinister Charles Le Sorcier and his heirs. Yet having found upon careful inquiry that there were no known descendants of the Alchemist, I would fall back to my occult studies, and once more endeavor to find a spell that would release my house from its terrible burden. Upon one thing I was absolutely resolved. I should never wed, for since no other branches of my family were in existence, I might thus end the curse with myself. I would wager my remaining time on recovering the knowledge amassed by my ancestors and finding within it the true nature of this curse and a means to break it. As I drew near the age of 30, growing ever more focused on the limits of my own life, old Giselle was quietly called to the land beyond. In silent grief, and alone upon the estate, I yet attempted to provide for her as proper a funeral as one man could muster. I buried her orant beneath the western crest of the motte, from which, in life, she had watched the settings of the sun. 3. Of my exact age, even down to days and hours, I kept a most careful record, for each movement of the pendulum of the massive clock in the library told off so much more of my doomed existence. Not since the tragedy had even one of my line reached his 33rd birthday. Disconcertingly soon I approached that time which I had so long viewed with apprehension. Since most of my ancestors had been seized some little while before they reached the exact age of the Comte Henri at his end, I was every moment on the watch for the coming of the unknown death. In what strange form the curse should overtake me I knew not, but I was resolved at least that it should not find me a cowardly or passive victim. With new vigor, I applied myself to the secrets of the old chateau and its contents, desperate to wrest a cure from the gray clasp of time. It was upon one of the longest of all my excursions of discovery in the deserted portion of the castle, less than a month before the fatal hour which I reckon must mark the utmost limit of my stay on earth, beyond which I could have not even the slightest hope of continuing to draw breath, that I came upon the culminating event of my whole life. I had spent the better part of the morning in climbing up and down half-ruined staircases in one of the most dilapidated of the ancient turrets. As the afternoon progressed, I sought the lower levels, descending into what appeared to be either a medieval place of confinement or a more recently excavated storehouse for gunpowder. As I slowly traversed the niter-encrusted passageway at the foot of the last staircase, the paving became very damp, and soon I saw by the light of my flickering torch that a blank, water-stained wall impeded my journey. I turned to retrace my steps in the darkness of the stairwell, only to find that my left foot uncovered an obstruction in the litter-strewn floor. Examination soon revealed an iron ring, well bolted to a trap door. I could not account for the presence of such an aperture below what should have been the thick dust of many years of neglect. Instead, I found detritus, decomposition, and yet perhaps even obfuscation of the passage. I became convinced this access had been intentionally disguised. Given this, I chose to pause a moment in my investigation and to return to the pantry much above. There I equipped me with my canvas field jacket, into the pockets of which I hastily thrust the accoutrement of a bituminous torch and another, a can of oil, a flint and steel, my brace of picks wrapped in oilcloth, and enough paper and charcoal for notes or rubbings. Lastly, I stepped through to the inner porch, retrieving my sturdy trekking baton in anticipation of unsure footing. Upon returning to the passage, I lit my first torch and examined the trap. Its planking was certainly ancient, but the locking mechanism held an almost modern design. Upon its eventual solution with liberal use of oil and picks, I then applied my baton as a lever to raise the heavy door. A black aperture was revealed, which exhaled noxious fumes, causing my torch to sputter and, on pressing further, disclosed in the unsteady glare the top of a flight of stone steps. As soon as the torch, which I lowered into the repellent depths, burned freely and steadily, I commenced my descent. The steps were many, and led to a narrow stone-flagged passage which I knew must be far underground. This passage proved of great length and terminated in a massive brazen door, lined and speckled with verdigris, and dripping with the cold moisture of the place. It stoutly resisted all my attempts of ingress by force. Momentarily infuriated by yet another obstacle, I took time to consider. The dust on the bottom landing was, on the whole, far thicker than that upon the trapdoor. Here rested the dust not of decades, but of centuries. It had precipitated undisturbed across the full expanse of the floor, it seemed, excepting a wing-shaped sweep situated between the door and the first step. My immediate sensations were incapable of analysis. Someone had passed this way. This passage was surely not recent. Years, perhaps even decades, intervened. Nonetheless, I was immediately stabbed with wariness. Higher upon the steps, into the iron scent of burning dust, I lay down my torch, and, by its limited light, returned to the landing. Though the torch still lit the edges of the steps and the moats in the air, it did not shine directly upon the landing. In that black shadow, against the cold brazen door, I lay me down, my shoulder to the floor of the curiously swept passage. I closed my eyes. My heart was pounding deafness into my ears, but I forced myself to be patient. And, when my heart finally slowed and my eyes opened, I remained breathless and intensely listening. My silent, cold fingers eventually located a space beneath the thick brass door. Through this, with my left eye, I gazed the entire time into utter blackness. If some other interloper were to pass this portal, I would see his torch. I would hear his footfalls, the scraping of his soles in the dust. Instead, I saw nothing and heard only echoes, which eventually resolved in my mind to be the result of slow dripping water from many sources far away. I fancied I could even smell the brass corroding the whole time, bristling a bit more green, a bit more gray, as the condensation crawled its length. I waited for calm, and it slowly returned. My mind convinced itself that there was at least one other person with access to this place, and, through forbearance, I had gained the advantage against him. I stood and retrieved my torch. It was shortened, but still bright. I sat upon the lock of the door, oiling and testing, attempting to ascertain its mechanism. Then, even before the challenge had begun, the last tumbler fell with a slight click, and the heavy door swung inward by half a hand's breadth. Somehow this meager triumph filled me with confidence. I took a deep breath and pressed against the door. Though it began to swing forward with ease, it soon slowed, screeching horribly. I ceased my advance immediately, feeling the blood retreat from my face as I imagined what ghastly troglodytes might swarm forth in response to the noise. I waited, pale and silent, with held breath, until the echoes finally died into the vast space beyond. When I could again hear nothing without, other than the dripping water, and see nothing but unbroken darkness, I examined the door frame. Alongside the inches-thick door itself, the heavy hinges were exposed. Upon these I applied more oil, rocking the door back and forth slowly until its motion smoothed. The gap thus widened, I pressed forth again into the darkness. As the rays of my torch levered the chamber into view, I was scarcely able to suppress a cry. I had entered into a great natural cavern with smaller branches questing into every distance. It seemed the broad grottos underlying the Comte were even more expansive than Giselle's tales had suggested. As to how to proceed, I could detect no clue. The dust of the stair gave way here to the wet grit of the cave floor, the soaking moisture of which began to infill my shallow boot prints, mere moments after I vacated them. Overcome with the urge of discovery, and only distantly recognizing the danger of becoming lost, I chose arbitrarily to follow the left wall, using my charcoal both to blaze every sharp turn or stalagmite I passed, and with the paper to keep a crude map of the passage. For at least an hour I so walked, faithfully keeping always the wall to my left. The limestone all about formed figures, graceful stalactites, pillars, thick stalagmites, and even occasional curtains and other formations. When my mind finally began to acclimate to the sweeping shadows and stunning vastness of every new perspective, the fear slightly receded, and I was forced to admit the primordial, otherworldly beauty of the onyx caverns as the glimmering drops of moisture continued to carve with timeless perseverance. My own patience, however, was burning as low as my torch. Over an hour from the entrance, just as I was considering doubling back, I heard water rushing rather than dripping. My course along the wall soon brought me to a pristine stream of width no more than a stride in the narrower turns. It gushed forth from the left wall, then cut through the floor into the deep gloom which stretched to the right. I bent to examine it closely before crossing, and I spied beneath the crystalline water a few pale, eyeless salamanders scurrying playfully among the pebbles. From this stream I sipped a few mouthfuls of cool, pure water and was refreshed. I dried my hands, then took a moment to refine my map. I then made the decision to continue only until the failure of my first torch, to ignite my second and retrace my steps. Now that I had the stream for a landmark, I felt much less likely to lose my way. I resumed my course, but soon made a less welcome discovery. A shadow padding wetly across the floor. I leapt involuntarily at the sight, crouching and brandishing the remnant of my torch toward it. The echo of a short, disgusting squeal convinced me that it had been a rat fleeing the flame. I advanced, pressing my weakening torch ahead of me, holding it low. Treading more carefully, I witnessed more verminous shades scurrying back into the gloom. Then I stopped short, choking in disgust. There, in the orange circle of my torchlight, a shallow but broad declivity in the floor, I found what I could only imagine was a midden. Here were bones of fowl and perhaps dogs, vegetable marrows, scraps of rag, and the reek of night soil. Still, it was not at these that I was compelled to stare. Deeper in the pile, what I had first thought were the bones of sheep were, upon finding a cage of ribs, a femur split rudely lengthwise like firewood, and a half-buried skull, proven to include at least some bones of man. Incredulous, despite my revulsion, I attempted to drive off the remaining shadows by inclining close to the reeking offal. Was that, further beyond, a cloven scapula? These must indeed have been human bones, but so small. A stabbing pain bit my palm, and I reflexively dropped the last fragment of my torch. It fell hissing into the waste, magnifying both the stench and blackness of the atmosphere. I cursed under my breath and took a few halting steps backward to escape the noisome pile, groping with my baton to find footing in the dark. I began to search for my remaining torch and tinder. The sharp pain in my hand slowed my progress, yet I was desperate to restore illumination. Nonetheless, as I finally laid hold of my flint and steel, I realized the darkness was not, in fact, absolute. I fought the urge to strike, and instead poised myself silently as my eyes adapted. There was, indeed, light here, but not an open flame nor lantern's globe. It was instead a fine line. Two, in fact, one horizontal, the other perpendicular, as the first quadrant of a cross. Carefully I crept forward, the tip of the baton sweeping slowly side to side at every step of my approach. Soon it was clear I had found a door, slightly ajar, with light bleeding dimly, both beside and below it. I drew closer, unsure whether the hidden source of this light flickered. Had a shadow moved somewhere beyond the door? I drew near, raised and gripped my baton in the manner of a cudgel. I leaned into a crouch, measuring out 3 strides ahead, preparing to reach the door, kick it open, and charge within. 4. Before I could advance, the heavy door flew open almost with its own will. A rush of sear air followed, and an unperturbed figure glided stoically into view. This presence of man or spirit produced in my brain a horror of the sharpest aspect. I fell back onto my heels, my eyes starting from their orbits at the sight. There, in the ancient Gothic doorway, stood a tall human figure. It was that of a man clad in a skull cap and long medieval tunic of dark color. His long hair and flowing beard were profuse, in a terrible and intense black hue. His forehead high beyond the usual dimensions, his cheeks deep, sunken, and heavily lined with wrinkles, and his hands, long, claw-like and gnarled, were of such a deathly, marble-like whiteness as I have never elsewhere seen in man. His figure, lean to the proportions of a skeleton, was strangely bent and almost lost within the voluminous folds of his peculiar garment. But strangest of all were his eyes, twin caves of abysmal blackness, profound in expression of understanding, yet inhuman in degree of iniquity. These were now fixed upon me, piercing my soul with their cold hatred, and rooting me to the spot whereon I stood. At last the figure spoke in a rumbling voice that chilled me through with its dull hollowness and effortless malevolence. The language in which the discourse was clothed was that debased form of Latin in use among the more learned men of the Middle Ages, and made familiar to me by my prolonged researches into the works of old alchemists and demonologists. It came now to my ears as effortlessly as my native language. "Comte, you arrive early. Please be welcome. Here, let me take your staff." 5. The gentle warmth pouring forth from the door suffused me. It was clear to me that a mere trekking pole was inappropriate to carry into so fine a house. Absently, my baton clattered to the hard cave floor, rolling, forgotten, back into the darkness. "Come, come," spake his eyes, "herein by the fire." I walked into his fine drawing-room. There, in a great stone brazier, was a flame performing a lively dance among coals, which my host fed welcomingly. The exquisitely carved brazier stood near the base of a Roman pillar painted in a beautiful pattern of vermilion and sienna. Obviously, a brazier standing this high was unsuitable for couches, so naturally I took my place reclining against the pillar. The welcome heat began to thaw my chilled face. "Rest yourself. Do not carry those heavy arms, that exhausted frame, one step further. I then saw the lovely ribbons of braided silk wound around the column, placed ingeniously to wrap one in an embrace, allowing him to lounge into their cradling coils, and so to more effortlessly enjoy the fire. They fit about my arms and waist perfectly. I sighed gratefully and relaxed as they took my weight. At this, the apparition smiled in an expression that, on a less noble countenance, might have been condescension, and I listened in perplexity as, without any other prompting, he began expounding somewhat rudely regarding the curse which had hovered over my house. Indeed, he chose even to remind me of my looming end, dwelling on the great wrong perpetrated by my ancestor against old Michel Mauvais, and gloating over the revenge of Charles le Sorcier. I felt flushed. In fact, I perceived the warmth of the fire rapidly becoming less comforting. Seeking distance, I struggled somewhat against the ribbons. Curiously, they failed to release me, instead somehow causing a dull clanking to become audible. My host continued narrating to me the escape of Charles, his retreat into the hills, and the clandestine recovery of his books, alchemical supplies, and other valuables, too outre in aspect to have yet been looted from his manse. I learned of Charles annexing this cave, resuming his craft, refining his lair and equipment, advancing himself in secret to then, years later, return and slay Godfrey, the heir de Se, with an arrow before he could reach his 33rd year. Given the subject and audience of his discourse, I thought the expression my host wore showed a wholly impolite amount of joy. Indeed, the story had become more of a diatribe than a narrative, and its recounting was taking place in a room more suitable for grim research than congenial entertainment, especially as it grew almost intolerably bright and hot. I tried again vainly to escape the silk chains. The formidable man continued, recounting the way Charles had seized Robert, son of Godfrey, in a field, forced poison down his throat, and left him to die at the age of 32, thus maintaining once more the foul provisions of his vengeful curse. At this point I began to blatantly wonder by what means clanking chains might be woven from silk and stapled to a rude post, and how such a blood-stained wooden stanchion might ever be mistaken for a Roman pillar. But I was soon distracted by the even greater mystery implied by the tale. How had the curse been fulfilled since the time when Charles le Sorcier must, in the course of nature, have died? Yet the man digressed into an account of deep alchemical studies begun years earlier by the two wizards, father and son. He then spoke most particularly of the research Charles le Sorcier completed after his father had been taken from him. Studies chiefly concerning the elixir which should grant to him who partook of it eternal life. My host's wistful passion for the subject had seemed for the moment to drain from his terrible gaze the hatred that had thus far so haunted it. Perhaps it was this momentarily introspective distraction of his eyes, or the blazing heat of the coals, or the final reawakening of my own plodding, indolent intellect, but the scene at last became fully clear. 6. Upon meeting this madman's stare, and hearing his invitation, I had dropped my only weapon, walked into a laboratory which more closely resembled an abattoir, and voluntarily chained myself to a blood-stained post which stood a few feet away from a brazier of coals already glowing an angry red. Hopelessness pounced onto my mind so completely it seemed preposterous even to continue drawing breath. A mordant smile of utter defeat moved to my lips involuntarily. To my surprise, the hideous man responded in kind, and so unknowingly betrayed his weakness. In his pride, smiling in assumed victory, he continued to soliloquize. At this, I purposefully maintained my grimace of apparent concession, altering my stance as if better to hear his monologue. What little adroitness I yet possessed, I concealed behind me, within my chained arms, as my fingers found the pocket containing my brace of picks. At my evident ignorance of his recitations, the pitchy eyes once more flashed malevolently, until, despite my feigned resignation, I trembled in instinctive dread of his stare. Then the wretch slowly turned his hideous gaze away from me to the racks of esoteric glasswork on the bench behind him. Almost offhandedly he seemed to choose some vessel and to begin adding into it drops from select others. I fancied I could even hear a chuckle of mirth tumbling deep within his chest. My well-practiced fingers continued assailing the locks hidden behind me, though the rest of my body was paralyzed with dread. The devil then found his fullest voice, and, in his smooth, casual manner, let fall those words which have ever afterward haunted my days and nights. "Fool," he mused, addressing the ewers and retorts as the containers in his hands chimed lightly against one another. "Can you not guess my secret? Have you no brain whereby you may recognize the will which has, through 6 long centuries, fulfilled the dreadful curse upon your house? Have I not told you of my father and our great discovery of the elixir of eternal life? Know you not how the secrets of alchemy were solved? His own formulae were the key. All he lacked were a few more decades." Indeed, I had guessed his secret, and, with the appalling exception of my left manacle's obstinate lock, felt I had composed quite a cogent rejoinder. But suddenly the fiendish glare returned, and, with a shocking sound like the hissing of a serpent, the alchemist raised a glass phial with the evident intent of ending my life, as had Charles Le Sorcier, 600 years before, ended that of my ancestor. Only then saw Charles, too late, that thrust into the searing coals of the brazier was the head of my last bituminous torch, and, gripping its hilt, the white-knuckled fist of my free right hand. Delirious with anger and still tethered to the post by one wrist, I lunged and swung the torch at the phial desperately. The glass shattered, the liquid within igniting instantly and pouring in a flaming gout down the torso of the malignant wizard. A shriek of fright and impotent hate erupted from the would-be assassin as the incendiary fluid showered him. In that moment of hope, I stepped back from the conflagration, casting about for a key or any other way to free my left wrist. But then I saw, though his beard burned like cerecloth, and even the lobe of his ear crackled as would a tallow, his diabolic robe seemed utter proof against the fire. Perfunctorily, with his robed forearm, he extinguished first his own ear, then easily suffocated the flames about his face. Seeing my foe still standing in a pool of fire, recovering from a blow which would have been death to any unenchanted man, the last of my rationale left me. Raving, I charged. Ignoring the chains and flames, I lurched directly toward him. Far away from me, in another attention, I heard the bones in my left wrist snap. I felt the thews in my left arm tear. But, most presently, I felt the torch in my right hand strike down upon the skull of Charles Mauvais. He fell to the floor, into the remains of the phial's contents still burning at our feet. Where these flames met his robe, they were at once extinguished. But where they met his beard, they leapt to greater life. As his beard burned away and his dark mane of hair began to catch fire, he nonetheless laughed at me. Then, almost nonchalantly, daubing away the flames with his sleeve, he met my gaze and began to stand. It was clear to me then that I was beaten. Any man who could laugh away his own immolation was stronger than I many times over. I was burned, broken, chained, and hopeless, with his black, bottomless eyes laying bare the totality of my weakness. I had only now to fall and fulfill again the curse of my line. Yet, an ancient part of my soul grimly rejected this final defeat. Behind my orbits, in the cage of my mind, stalked and scraped the outraged pride of centuries of progenitors. And so, into that smug expression, turned then toward me in superiority, I chose not to capitulate. Instead, with gnashing purpose, I ground the head of the torch into his face, as might a heavy pestle be forced into a mortar, whereupon, miraculously, he screamed. He howled in the most gorgeous pain. And with that clarion, my courage returned. I deliberately dragged that smoldering figure closer toward the post, so that my unchained hand might encompass him more fully. There I continued to burn his face. Once his eyes were finally destroyed, he could no longer bewitch me. My ravening began to subside as threads of clearer thoughts strove to return. Then I realized, his clever robe aside, the man himself was aged nigh unto the pharaohs. In truth, his body was now little more than a spiteful bundle of morbid tinder. Forthwith and again I thrust the torch directly against his flesh, his hands, his neck, every part of his unprotected skin that I could reach. He combusted like century-cured kindling. Soon his screams became mere rasps, hardly audible above the flames, and his struggles lost their vigor, resolving only into an inward folding of his form. Of his impervious robe I then fashioned a makeshift furnace, roughly containing and directing the flames as they incinerated his accursed, roiling remains. I must allow, observing the death agony of this almost eternal foe of my line was the pinnacle of my life experience. Never since has more joy than mine own been taken upon the exquisite suffering of an inferior other. For centuries my line had been humbled by the weight of this man's impertinent madness. As he fell to ash, I felt taller, mightier than I had ever before thought possible. Then I collapsed. 7. The heat, the fumes, and the pain of the broken bones within my wrist drove me twice more to unconsciousness, tethered like a rag doll to that stanchion. Still, eventually I woke and retained my wits long enough to defeat the lock of my final manacle, free myself, extinguish the remaining flames, and move to the relative coolness and safety of the doorframe. I lay against the jamb coughing and gasping as breath and life slowly returned. The dread of years fell from my shoulders, for I knew that he whom I had slain was the source of all my danger from the curse. Great relief welled in my breast. I thought I might rest for days there on that cool floor. But instead, within moments, a new urge crept into my mind. Now that I was free, I could not repress a perverse craving to learn more of the malicious intellect and sinister will which had haunted my line for centuries and made of my own youth one long unfolding nightmare. Haltingly, I stood and hobbled to the bookshelves, heedlessly pulling down books and searching through cabinets. I soon found his journals, though they were secured with a cipher, but many of the rest of these works were known to me from my own studies. Even before solving his cipher, it was clear by his diagrams that, where I had found only confusion, Charles had discovered enlightenment and truths. The very order of the tomes on their shelves and the colors of the ribbons within them were telling. His mastery of symbology and language had enabled him to follow threads of concepts between tomes and among authors that I always lost mid-route. It would take weeks to decipher his journals, and years more for me to fully understand all that I had found here. But, in a realization foreign to me for more than a decade, I came to know that I had time. Without question, Charles had been a genius. Had he avoided his obsession with revenge, surely he could have strode forth and advanced the entire race of humanity, likely in the process becoming a king himself in wealth, and perchance in name. Instead, he chose to barter centuries of his own ensorcelled life for little more joy than what could be extracted as suffering from my family. Although a curse to all my forefathers, this concentration of rancor proved a blessing to myself. Unwittingly, Charles had enticed me to discover his sanctum and to delve into his hoard of knowledge. Then, in the final conflagration, he had failed to prevent me from taking all of it, his life included, ultimately to enrich both my own life and prospects. 8. Indeed, there, in Charles' very cavern, I found glimmering yellow proof of his own solution. Upon another workbench, an apple, a book, a spinning wheel, a bellows, a tableau of common shapes, yet each made of purest gold, transformed by the art of Charles from their own simple matter into treasures. Though Charles seemed to retain these objects as mere curios, or perhaps proof of his art, I immediately put them to more practical use, melting them one after another into rude ingots of wealth. Though it pained me to spend even a few hours away from the hard-won potency of my newly acquired laboratory, I took steps to secure and begin restoration of my chateau. With the gold at hand, I bought the loyalty of new retainers, a verger, a carpenter, and 2 masons. To direct them and revitalize the estate, I hired both a stalwart reeve and a capable seneschal. In a matter of a few short weeks, the respectability of my ancient house began to return. I was comped now, not only in title, but also in the hearts of the peasantry. I sought, then, to become much more. Eventually, I broke the single ingenious cipher behind which all the works of my nemesis hid, and I then began to learn their stories and to loot their treasures. 500 or more years ago, the prodigy Charles had solved the first riddle, that of the elixir of life. This discovery proved to be a basic tenet of trans-elementalism, a poison which, upon completing its action, converted flesh into a balm. As every material is formed with certain traits common to many, every human is born with some apportionment of animation, of life, brightest at birth and dwindling as the years aggress. Simple it was for Charles to find these younglings among the progeny of the Comte d'Ache, entice them into the grottos, and, administering the poison by guile or force, reap from them their own disposition of life. Their marrows and most vital organs were the final ingredient in the elixir. Their bones, on the other hand, were mere offal, piled over the centuries into the foul midden which I had found in the caves. Now I had uncovered the underground warrens which pervade this land, and I had learned the profit to which Charles Mauvais had committed the deaths of those lowly whelps. The subsequent solution of the alchemists was more complex, taking at least another century of further effort. Deep within the caves, Charles had finally found that buried stratum which underpins this entire land, too adamant to be slaked by water, too old even to retain the fossilized bones of this land's primordial inhabitants. Laced throughout this ancient extrusion, he discovered the soul of the mountain, the heart-blood of the earth itself, veins of red carbuncle which, having risen, molten, eons ago, had hardened into the nigh impervious red jewels which now lace the silicate floors of our deepest caverns. By Charles' formulae, this gem is made to flow once more, with the subtlest vitriol applications, admixture of salts essential to the materials to be added, and precise concentration of the solution in a container lined with powerful lodestone. The crucial catalysts required to transform each base material into purest gold were synthesized. Although it cost me many months of grueling work, decipherings, and experimentation, eventually I wrested both of these great secrets from the journals of my foe and claimed them both as my own. 9. And so now, a year and a season after the vanquishing of my father's foe, and 34 years after my own birth, again the ancient towers begin to rise. The mason's mortar, the carpenter hammers, the fields themselves now burst forth in fruit and grain. We have established trade with many of the crafts guilds, and even with the hated Comte Asch, the denizens of which glare at our healthy fields and burgeoning markets with undisguised covetousness. Even my own peasants have set aside their notions of woe, and now speak instead of new rumors. One of these is a tale of an ancient curse defeated, and the overdue prosperity withheld for years now breaking free and flowing copiously. Another story expounds upon the acumen of their Comte, who spends so gratuitously on his garrison and grounds, taxes his peasants so lightly, and yet somehow gains great profits when selling the produce of the manor, insisting on his personal involvement, and emerging from every mercantile exchange with a heavier purse than might any other negotiator. But of course, what need have I of money? If I were to sell a gross of retted flax bundles at a minimal price, then recover the shortfall threefold with gold from my own secreted stock, who of mine own Comte would know? Indeed, while the profits kept flowing, who would care? Any conductor of business will be deemed prosperous if he never lacks that precious metal, and a man who learns the true secrets of the heart of the mountain will never be without it. And so the Comtesse flourishes. Yet the boon does not fall so kindly on the Comte Asch, whose produce is ignored for finer fare from afar, and whose children in their fields, on the most moonless or cloud-filled nights, still go missing almost as frequently as before. After centuries of deficit, now finally the rightful balance returns to Comtesse. A fully seasoned Comte walks this land, welcomed and rejoiced by his people. And in that very man's shoes, across his same sun-blessed fields, walks also the adept who tore forth the heart secrets of both human and mountain from the profligate misanthrope who, for centuries, madly haunted this alveolate land. I now maintain in perpetuity what he could only conceive in spiteful exigency. I am the Comte. I am the Alchemist. Je suis Antoine, le sorcier.